In August 1990, the college town of Gainesville, Florida, was plunged into terror. Students at the University of Florida were just settling in for the fall semester, chasing dreams, making friends and planning their futures, when a predator began stalking them in the night. Over just 4 days, 5 young students were butchered in their own homes. Some were sexually assaulted, others posed grotesquely after death, and the brutality shocked even seasoned investigators. Gainesville became a city under siege. Students fled, doors were barricaded, and fear spread across the nation. The man behind it all? Danny Harold Rolling, a drifter from Louisiana with a violent past, a failed family life, and a hunger for control. A man who would later be known as the Gainesville Ripper. But the most chilling part? Gainesville wasn't his first bloodshed. Months earlier, an entire family in Shreveport, Louisiana, was slaughtered in eerily similar fashion. A crime Rolling would only confess to years later as he awaited his own execution. To understand how a troubled boy from an abusive home became one of America's most notorious serial killers, and what he said and sang in the final moments before his lethal injection, we have to go back to where it all began. But first, hit subscribe and tap the bell icon, because this is a case that will stay with you long after the screen fades to black. Danny Harold Rolling was born on May 26, 1954, in Shreveport, Louisiana, into a home that should have offered him warmth and safety, but instead became the breeding ground for pain, neglect, and violence. His father, James Harold Rolling, was a decorated Navy veteran who later served as a Shreveport police officer, but behind closed doors he was a harsh and domineering man, known to brutally beat his wife Claudia, Danny, and his younger brother. Witness accounts, along with later testimony from family and psychological reports, describe a father who belittled his son, calling him weak and worthless, and who seemed determined to break him rather than build him. Danny's mother, overwhelmed by the abuse, reportedly attempted to leave the marriage multiple times but often returned, leaving the children trapped in an environment of fear. From a young age, Danny showed signs of emotional turmoil. He was withdrawn, prone to truancy, and struggled to form healthy connections with his peers. As a teenager, he turned to petty theft, voyeurism, and wandering the streets at night, behaviors that hinted at darker compulsions developing beneath the surface. Later in life, Rolling would write about his own childhood, describing a sense of never belonging, of being beaten down until he felt less than human, a broken child searching for control in a world where he had none. In court documents and psychiatric evaluations, experts would later emphasize how that cycle of abuse and humiliation planted the seeds for the violent fantasies that would consume him as an adult. This was the beginning of a cycle of violence that would escalate into murder. A boy who grew up terrified of his father would, decades later, terrify an entire community. On the night of November 4, 1989, the city of Shreveport, Louisiana, was shaken by a crime so brutal that even seasoned detectives struggled to comprehend what they had seen. Inside the modest home of William Tom Grissom, a 55-year-old grandfather, police discovered a scene of unimaginable violence. Tom Grissom lay dead, along with his 8-year-old grandson Sean, who had been stabbed repeatedly. But it was the body of Tom's daughter, 24-year-old Julie Grissom, that bore the most disturbing hallmarks of the killer's twisted psyche. Julie had been murdered in her bedroom, her body carefully washed and then grotesquely posed in a sexual manner, her hair brushed and her corpse arranged almost like a doll. For investigators, it was immediately clear that this was not a random attack or a simple home invasion. This was the work of someone who derived satisfaction not only from killing, but from staging his victims afterward, creating a tableau meant to shock and disturb anyone who found it. At the time, police in Shreveport had few leads. The killer had vanished into the night, leaving only questions behind. It wasn't until nearly 17 years later, in 2006, just before his execution in Florida, that Danny Rolling would finally confess that he had been the one who slaughtered the Grissom family. That confession would confirm what many investigators had long suspected, that the path to Gainesville's horrors had truly begun in Shreveport with the Grissom's blood. Only months after that night of terror in May 1990, Rolling's violence turned inward, back to the source of much of his lifelong rage, his father. During a heated confrontation, Danny took a gun and shot James Harold Rolling, the man who had abused and belittled him for years. James survived, but the injuries were devastating. He was left permanently blind in one eye, missing an ear, and disfigured. This violent act marked a turning point. Danny was no longer just the broken son of an abusive father. He was now a man who had crossed the line into attempted murder, carrying within him a growing taste for violence. From that point on, Rolling became a true drifter. By the summer of 1990, he was moving through the South, stealing cars, breaking into homes, robbing stores, and living in makeshift camps in the woods. He traveled from Louisiana into Florida, blending in with transient workers and hitchhikers, always one step ahead of the law. But beneath the surface, he was preparing himself, sharpening his skills, and feeding the fantasies that had taken root since childhood. From August 24 to August 27, 1990, the quiet college town of Gainesville, Florida descended into a living nightmare as Danny Rolling unleashed a series of brutal killings that would forever scar the community. On the morning of August 24, Rolling began his reign of terror by targeting two young University of Florida freshmen, Sonia Larson, 18, and Christina Powell, 17, who shared an off-campus apartment. After silently approaching their home, Rolling pried his way inside, wielding a hunting knife with a cold, calculated precision. Sonia was attacked first, her body left sprawled on the second floor, while Christina was brutally assaulted and murdered downstairs. Rolling's violence did not end with death. In a chilling echo of his disturbed mind, he posed their bodies in grotesque, staged positions meant to degrade them, leaving behind a crime scene that investigators later described as one of the most disturbing they had ever encountered. This was not a random attack. It was the opening act of something much darker. The next night, on August 25, Rolling struck again, this time targeting Krista Hoyt, 18, a bright, independent student who lived alone in a small duplex. He waited for her return home, ambushed her, and committed yet another horrific murder. What made this killing stand out was the savagery and deliberate shock value. After stabbing and mutilating her, Rolling decapitated Krista, placing her head on a bookshelf in a twisted display meant to terrorize anyone who discovered the scene. Her lifeless body was staged in a position that revealed the killer's obsession with power, control, and humiliation. For Gainesville police, this second murder confirmed their worst fears. They were facing a sadistic predator who thrived not just on killing, but on psychological warfare. By August 27, the city was already on edge, but Rolling's fury was not finished. He turned his attention to an apartment shared by Manuel Manny Tabawada, 23, and Tracy Poles, 23, both University of Florida students. Manny, a strong, athletic young man, tried desperately to fight back, and in doing so became the only victim to mount significant resistance against Rolling. But even Manny's courage could not stop the intruder. After a violent struggle, Manny was killed and Rolling turned his knife on Tracy. She pleaded for her life, but in a calculated, merciless attack, he silenced her forever. Like the others, Tracy's body was left in a staged position, completing Rolling's grotesque signature. The impact of these murders on Gainesville was immediate and devastating. News of the killings spread like wildfire, and a sense of paralyzing fear gripped the entire University of Florida campus. Students abandoned their apartments in droves, many fleeing home or seeking safety in hotels. Parents rushed to Gainesville to protect their children, while dormitories went on strict lockdown. Police patrols tripled, yet nothing seemed to calm the community's dread. Television news broadcasts carried images of tearful students, packed prayer vigils, and interviews with terrified young people who slept in shifts, afraid of what might happen in the night. Gainesville, once a vibrant college town, had become a city under siege. Behind the chaos, Rolling operated like a hunter in the shadows. He set up a makeshift campsite deep in the woods, surviving off canned goods and blending into the environment while stalking his next targets. From his hidden vantage points, he would watch, wait, and plan his attacks, marking doors with tape to test if residents were home, and slipping silently into apartments when opportunity struck. He thrived on stealth, patience, and the ability to terrorize from the darkness, a predator feeding on fear. Within 96 hours, Danny Rolling forever changed Gainesville, leaving behind 5 young lives extinguished, countless others traumatized, and a community that would never again feel safe in its own homes. At first, Gainesville police found themselves chasing shadows. The murders were so violent, so calculated, that panic consumed both the public and investigators alike. With no clear suspect, the police turned their eyes to a young man named Edward Humphrey, a troubled University of Florida student known for his erratic behavior and violent outbursts. Humphrey, who had a history of mental health struggles and a recent assault charge, seemed to fit the profile in the eyes of detectives desperate for answers. For weeks, his face filled newspapers and television broadcasts, cementing him as the presumed killer in the public's mind. Yet behind the scenes something wasn't lining up. The evidence against him was circumstantial at best. No DNA, no fingerprints, nothing connecting him directly to the crime scenes. Still, while Gainesville residents clung to the hope that the murderer was in custody, the real killer remained hidden, watching events unfold from the shadows of his wooded campsite. The true breakthrough in the investigation came when detectives began to draw connections between the Gainesville murders and an unsolved triple homicide that had occurred in Shreveport, Louisiana, in November 1989. The similarities were chilling. The brutality, the post-mortem mutilation, and the staging of bodies bore the same cruel signature. It was here that a woman named Cindy Jurisic entered the story. Cindy, a former acquaintance of Danny Rolling, had grown increasingly uneasy after the Gainesville murders made national headlines. The crimes sounded eerily like the violent fantasies Rolling had once shared with her. Unable to shake the dread in her gut, she contacted authorities, telling them she suspected Rolling could be the man behind the killings. Her tip shifted the entire trajectory of the investigation. By this time, Danny Rolling was already behind bars, but not for murder. On September 7, 1990, he was arrested in Ocala, Florida, following a botched robbery at a local Winn-Dixie supermarket. To investigators, he was just another armed thief sitting in county jail. But when police began to search Rolling's makeshift campsite in the woods near Gainesville, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place with terrifying clarity. Inside his tent, they uncovered a treasure trove of evidence that tied him directly to the killings. Rolls of duct tape identical to those used on his victims, tools that matched pry marks found on doors, food wrappers from the days surrounding the murders, and even a diary where Rolling confessed his darkest thoughts and violent urges. Blood-type samples recovered at the crime scenes matched his own, and later DNA testing would provide the final, damning link. As this evidence mounted, the narrative that had once condemned Edward Humphrey unraveled entirely. Rolling had been hiding in plain sight, blending into the landscape of Gainesville while terrorizing its students. From his camp in the woods, he stalked, watched, and waited, transforming the city into his hunting ground. What began as a desperate manhunt clouded with misdirection and false suspects was now focused on one man, a drifter, a thief, and a killer whose reign of terror had finally been cut short by his own recklessness. On November 15, 1991, after months of forensic testing, investigative work, and carefully connecting the evidence to the Gainesville murders, Danny Rolling was formally charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom was filled with tension. Families of the victims, members of the press, law enforcement officers who had worked the case for years, and even curious locals who wanted to see the man accused of bringing unimaginable terror to their town. Rolling sat shackled, his eyes darting across the room, seemingly soaking in the attention, while the state of Florida began building the case that would eventually secure his place on death row. 4 years, prosecutors prepared a massive amount of evidence against him. DNA linking him directly to the crime scenes, his written confessions in the form of disturbing poems and songs, and the chilling details of his crimes that only the killer could have known. But in an unexpected move that shocked both the prosecution and the families, on February 15, 1994, just before the trial was set to begin, Danny Rolling suddenly changed his plea to guilty on all 5 murder charges. He confessed in open court, sparing the jury from hearing the gruesome details during a drawn-out trial, but his guilty plea did not end the proceedings. Instead, it moved the case directly into the penalty phase, where the ultimate decision, life imprisonment or death, would be decided. The sentencing hearings revealed a chilling look into the mind of the Gainesville Ripper. Psychologists and experts painted Rolling as a deeply disturbed man with antisocial and borderline personality disorders, plagued by violent sexual fantasies that he eventually acted out in the most horrifying ways. They testified that Rolling exhibited classic signs of sadism, finding pleasure not just in murder but in the suffering, humiliation, and terror of his victims. Defense attorneys tried to argue that his abusive childhood and his father's cruelty played a role in shaping his violent tendencies, but the overwhelming evidence and the brutality of the crimes left little room for mercy. On April 20, 1994, the courtroom once again filled with the grieving families of the 5 victims as Judge Stan Morris prepared to deliver the final sentence. In a powerful moment captured on courtroom footage, the judge's words rang out with clarity. Danny Harold Rolling was to be sentenced to death. As the gavel came down, the families of the murdered students broke down in tears, some in relief, some in grief, knowing that justice, though painful, had been served. The state of Florida had decided that for crimes so heinous, so deliberate, and so devastating to the community, the only punishment fitting was death. The victims' families later spoke publicly, stressing that this was never about revenge, but about justice for the lives so brutally stolen. Parents wept as they described the bright futures their children had ahead of them, and friends shared memories of laughter, kindness, and ambition that would never be fulfilled. For them, Rolling's sentencing marked the beginning of a long healing process, though the scars of what happened in Gainesville would never fully disappear. After his sentencing in April 1994, Danny Harold Rolling was transferred to Florida State Prison, where he would spend the remainder of his life on death row. Unlike many other condemned inmates who faded into obscurity, Rolling found ways to maintain a presence from behind the prison walls. He began writing extensively, poems, songs, and chilling reflections on his crimes, and even produced haunting sketches that offered disturbing glimpses into the twisted world of his imagination. Rolling would later collaborate with true crime writer Sandra London, who not only published his confessions and drawings in the book The Making of a Serial Killer, but also became romantically involved with him. This partnership drew heavy criticism, as many accused London of exploiting the pain of the victims' families while providing Rolling with a platform to showcase his dark persona. Still, the book provided unsettling insight into the mind of the man who had terrorized Gainesville. Despite being locked away, Rolling's influence lingered in the public imagination. His art and writings revealed a self-styled alter ego he called Gemini, which he often claimed had driven him to kill. This dual personality theme mirrored his earlier history of abuse, trauma, and rage, but critics and psychologists dismissed it as a manipulative tactic designed to gain notoriety. Nevertheless, his words gave a disturbing voice to the fantasies and compulsions that had culminated in his crimes. Rolling was not content to remain silent, and the public's morbid fascination ensured that his story continued to surface in news headlines, books, and television specials. But Rolling's most chilling revelation came more than a decade after the Gainesville murders. In 2006, with his execution date drawing near, he made a startling confession that confirmed what investigators had long suspected. Rolling admitted his responsibility for the 1989 Shreveport triple homicide, in which he had brutally murdered 55-year-old Tom Grissom, his 24-year-old daughter Julie, and 8-year-old grandson Sean. The killings had remained unsolved for years, but detectives had noticed eerie similarities between the Shreveport crime scene and the Gainesville murders, details such as the positioning of the bodies and the ritualistic overtones of the attacks. With his confession, Rolling finally closed a chapter of lingering questions, though for the surviving family members, the wounds of loss were only reopened. On death row, Danny Rolling spent nearly 12 years awaiting his fate, becoming a figure of macabre curiosity for criminologists, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts. Some portrayed him as the product of a broken childhood, while others insisted he was nothing more than a sadistic predator who manipulated sympathy when convenient. In the end, Rolling himself left little doubt. His own words and drawings celebrated the darkness within him, ensuring that his name would be forever etched among the most notorious killers in American history. On October 25, 2006, after years of legal battles, appeals, and confessions that left an indelible mark on Florida's justice system, Danny Rolling, the man who terrorized Gainesville in the summer of 1990, was led into the death chamber at Florida State Prison in Stark. It was a moment that many had anticipated for more than 16 years, and for others, it was a night filled with complicated emotions. Justice for some, sorrow for others, and lingering trauma that no execution could ever erase. Before facing his final punishment, Rolling was granted the traditional right of a last meal, and he chose with deliberate indulgence. Lobster tail, shrimp, a baked potato, strawberry cheesecake, and a glass of sweet tea. It was a meal that stood in stark contrast to the life he had lived behind prison walls and the horrific violence that had brought him there. Guards and prison staff later noted how calm he appeared while eating, as though he had accepted his fate and was prepared to meet it with a strange sense of peace. When the time came, witnesses, including relatives of the slain students, were ushered into the execution chamber to watch through a pane of glass. They had waited over a decade and a half for this moment, and yet many found themselves wrestling with mixed emotions. Some hoped to finally feel the weight of closure, while others admitted no punishment could ever bring back their loved ones or truly balance the scales of justice. Rolling entered the chamber dressed in prison whites, strapped down onto the gurney as the lethal injection process was prepared. But before the chemicals coursed through his veins, he used his last moments not to speak, but to sing. In a haunting and almost hymn-like voice, Rolling began to deliver his final words through music. His voice, steady and reverent, echoed through the death chamber. "None greater than thee, O Lord, none greater than thee." It was not a defiant declaration, nor an apology to his victims' families, but rather a religious invocation, a plea for forgiveness, or perhaps an attempt at redemption in his final breath. Those in attendance described the moment as both chilling and surreal. The man who had brutally silenced so many young lives now used his own fading voice to praise a higher power. At precisely 6:13 p.m., after the final notes of his hymn faded into silence, the executioner administered the lethal injection, and Danny Rolling was pronounced dead. Outside the prison, crowds had gathered, some in protest against the death penalty, others in support of justice finally being served. Inside, the families of the victims sat with faces heavy with decades of grief. For some, there was relief in knowing the chapter had closed, while for others the pain remained raw, the absence of their children or siblings never to be filled. As reporters relayed the news across the nation, the story of Danny Rolling's crimes and his execution became another entry in Florida's long history of capital punishment. Yet, for the families of Krista Hoyt, Christina Powell, Sonia Larson, Tracy Poles, and Manuel Tabawada, October 25, 2006 was not the end, but merely a moment in the ongoing struggle to live with the shadow he had cast over their lives. Danny Rolling left behind no apologies to his victims' families, no words of remorse that could offer comfort. His final act was a song, a hymn that seemed meant for himself rather than those whose lives he destroyed. And with that, the Gainesville Ripper's story ended, but the scars of his crimes remain deeply etched in the hearts of all who lived through his reign of terror. That brings us to the chilling end of Danny Rolling's story, a man whose reign of terror left scars that will never fully heal. Now, I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe justice was served, or do you think no punishment could ever truly balance the horror of his crimes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. If you found this deep dive into true crime compelling, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with others who follow these stories, and of course subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next investigation into the darkest corners of human nature. Stay safe, stay aware, and I'll see you in the next true crime story.